Amy, why don't we start with you and why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Amy, and I live in Massachusetts. My son Alexander is 17 and a half, and he has long COVID.
Thank you. Robin?
Hi, I'm Robin. I'm from California, and we have 5 kids. Katie is our youngest. She has long COVID after having had COVID and MISC in September of 2021.
So, Robin, can we start with you and tell me a little bit about how your family contracted COVID and then the MISC as well?
We all got COVID at the same time. We were together at church and all got it. And at that point, it was time to go to church in 2021. And that was a risk we were taking by then. So all of us started having symptoms in August. And on Katie's first day of kindergarten, we realized that we had it. So we all got tested and all 6 of us had positive PCR tests, and Katie had a positive at-home test. My husband and I were really, really sick. We were able to stay home with the help of Zoom doctor appointments and medication and everything. And at the time, there was a lot of fires in California. So it was actually kind of dangerous to go outside. And so we had no fresh air, 7 of us stuck at home, breathing each other's viruses. And so I vaguely remember Katie's symptoms at the time being low-grade fever. She was pretty okay. She lost her sense of taste, and so her appetite was kind of hit and miss. But she did okay, and she was better. And when she could go back to school, she was recovered pretty 100% at that time. And then 4 weeks later, I had started back to work part-time and, was slugging through it myself, but she came down with a fever, about 103. And over the course of about 5 days, she had a fever up to 105. Her pediatrician ran labs to check for MISC, actually, it having been a really clear-cut case of COVID 4 weeks prior. They checked that she had the antibodies, they checked the labs, and it was starting to look that, but she was kind of clinically okay to be at home. But it continued to get worse. And unfortunately, after 2 ER visits and on the way home from the ER the second time, I got a call from the pediatrician who had looked at all of the tests from several ER visits and said, "You need to go back to the hospital." So we turned around and went back, and the ER said, "What are you doing here?" But she was very sick. She slept in our arms outside as it rained in this thunderstorm as we waited for the doctors to consult and decide what to do with her. And ultimately, they admitted her. They took her by ambulance to another hospital where they could have her on a pediatric floor. And so we were very lucky. She was treated with prednisone, IV prednisone, and after a few days, her labs and everything started to turn around just from the prednisone. A lot of kids with MISC can go into organ failure or whatever. So we were very lucky. She, at the worst, she had that fever and couldn't walk, wasn't eating, was dehydrated by the time we got in there, and refused to take any medicine. After several days, she was like, "This isn't working anymore. I'm not going to take this disgusting stuff." So they had to do IV Tylenol for her. And after 5 days, we were sent home with some prednisone that she was willing to take orally in order to not go through that again. So
Can I ask, that was 2000, the fall of 2001. Were you under the impression you were pretty safe? I mean, it was at that point in the pandemic where I think people thought they were pretty safe as families to go out and maybe attend church. Was that kind of a feeling you had?
I had the feeling that there was like some risk, but not, I felt like we would be okay because we were healthy. You know, we didn't really have any pre-existing conditions. My family has some neurodivergence, and that didn't occur to us at all. Yeah. That could be a risk factor. Having ADHD doesn't make you sicker, right? Yeah. So
I'll just pause here for the audience in case you don't know that for children, specifically, ADHD is overrepresented in the long COVID population. And so it is now thought of as if you are ADHD or neurodivergent in the broadest sense, even. So that includes like anxiety, that you are higher risk for developing long COVID in the pediatric population. And my point in asking that is I was wondering if most parents don't know that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely thought the kids would be fine. Right. And I was really, really surprised to be as sick as I was. Yeah. I wished I had known how sick we could be. And I wish, like, looking back at it, that we had driven to the coast or something where the smoke wasn't so bad. Because our knowing now a little bit more about viral load and things. I mean, at the time, I didn't know that much about COVID. I wasn't like reading about it or anything. And so
the messaging was, if you're healthy, you're okay. You know, there might be a small risk. Yeah. Amy, can you tell us about when your family got COVID?
So my son got COVID in March of 2022. So after the Omicron sort of first, like the big spike here in the Northeast was in January. He got it. We believe at school, his entire lunch table got COVID at the same time. So this was at a point where the school that he was at had really relaxed like their testing protocols and some of the mitigation steps in terms of in the previous year they were like a hybrid where 1 week half the school was in and half the school was online, and then they would flip. So there were two cohorts. But, when we got to the 21-22 school year, as even after Omicron, I think people just felt like, okay, it's better, we're done. And we know based on, that everybody got sick at the same time. He was the only one who, ended up having a high fever, headache, lots of congestion. He did not lose his sense of taste or smell, but he tested positive on home antigen tests for 10 days. So at that point, with the CDC guidelines, he could have been back at school, right? But we knew from him he was still symptomatic, so we didn't send him back. But at the point where he was no longer symptomatic and no longer testing positive, we were well beyond the guidance of having to wear a mask. And it's interesting that his friend group was very much, they voluntarily wore masks and things, but at the point where they got sick, they weren't masked. And he wasn't hospitalized. We took care of him at home because he's was 17 at the time. He was very self-aware, and he tested positive on morning when I wasn't home, and he went into his room and he stayed in his room by himself for the 2 weeks, and he didn't come out. And we only interacted with masks. He ate by himself. He did everything by himself. And my husband and I, because he's an only child, did not get sick.
This is so interesting because I have found that the children are actually sometimes the most informed about COVID and will proactively do things to protect family and friends. Thank you guys for sharing that, because those are, that's never easy to do. So Robin, it was her first week of school ever, kindergarten,
Right.
when your daughter Katie got sick.
Mm-hmm.
So then after she was in the hospital, did you think it was kind of okay? Were you expecting long COVID as a possibility?
Was I expecting long COVID? I was concerned about the long-term risks of that multi-inflammatory syndrome, and particularly things like her heart and getting sick again, because that was the big focus, was her heart, which makes sense. Fortunately, her heart was fine. They checked it pretty carefully and often in the hospital, and then followed her with a cardiologist. So she was excused, or they told us not to do anything strenuous with her. So no gymnastics, no PE for 6 months until she was cleared by the cardiologist. And then just being sick, I could see that she was still sort of recovering physically for a while.
Getting more like classic long COVID symptoms, or is this more just an extenuation of MIS-C, do you think?
I don't remember when she was diagnosed with long COVID exactly. But I do think it was probably in the months after the MIS-C. She was sick so often in the fall, and they were being really cautious at school, but she just caught everything, even though they were in masks and outside as much as possible and distancing. She just caught everything. And then over Christmas, I actually was in the ER with her again. And it kind of looked like the flu or something, but I insisted they check for her inflammatory markers. And those were high, but not like hospitalized, with MIS-C again high.
Right.
I think she ended up with like 1 dose of prednisone or something, and a lot of vitamins. But yeah, so she had a lot of that. I never saw, kind of what I was expecting from long COVID was maybe what I was having was the fatigue, and she did have that for sure. And then like her hair never fell out, and her she never complained about her heart or her stomach or numbness. But she did kind of struggle at school after a few months. Katie said something, and I checked in with her teacher. Katie says, I don't even know what step my friends are on because I'm so far behind. So she started to notice herself that she was just sluggish and slower than her peers to respond to questions or to finish her work. She started to be kind of self-aware that she was the last one doing the math test or whatever. It's kindergarten. So we did start to see that brain fog right after. And by the spring, she had a 504 because it was clear to the teacher that she needed some extra support, just time, and we wanted to document that.
So can I ask you, just to help other parents and potentially teachers? So very self-aware, Katie. to catch in kindergarten.
Yeah.
But was it slower processing of information or slower with new information, or was it like working memory kind of stuff?
It was hard to tell.
Yeah.
And I'm an analyst. So I'm like analyzing it all the time. I couldn't quite figure out what the hang up was. So it looked kind of like processing time, but it could be okay sometimes and not others.
Yeah.
And so some situations were better or easier for her than others. And then I noticed that Monday homework was a lot easier than Friday homework. So by Thursday, I'm like, this is just not happening. She just couldn't focus.
So the school recognized that she had long COVID as well, correct?
Yeah, well, they recognized these symptoms, right? So this, and then knowing that she had COVID and was in the hospital with MISC, like the teacher was really great about supporting her and identifying what she needed.
Mm-hmm.
So I have, so they started doing like, she needed extra prompting and redirection to stay on track. So she had close proximity, so kind of sitting near the teacher, peer partnering. Her she'd be buddied with a partner who could kind of support her in where she was at and staying on track.
Nice.
Flexible seating.
So those are common accommodations for like ADHD. I'm a former teacher, right? This feels different than ADHD though, right? To you,
what?
Did it feel different than ADHD to you?
I honestly couldn't tell. I mean, we have some ADHD in the family.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to, at the time, I was like, was this here before and we just didn't know? Or is this from Miss? So she did have preschool daycare. So I checked in with them and they said, no, none of this has ever been an issue for Katie. Yeah, and certainly some signs of that ADHD distractedness and energy. But I think what was different for Katie was the inconsistency. So the more fatigued she got, the worse these symptoms are.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I think that's really important for everybody to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Amy, how did you know that your son had long COVID?
Well, it's interesting because our school schedule, we have an April break, right? So by the time he was ready to go back to school, it was April break. And so when he went back at the end of April, there were some sleep issues where he would have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep or getting up or a combination, but it was a very slow sort of a ramp up. And then my son has both food allergies and environmental allergies. And then we had the peak pollen season. And so the peak pollen season always, even with 5 years of allergy shots, is always a challenge. And it seemed like it was a very tough spring for him. And like one Zyrtec a day wasn't enough and that kind of thing. And, but it really wasn't until probably like mid-May where we started to notice like there was almost like a pattern developing with the sleep issues. And he has always been a high executive functioning child, high academic performer, and, starting to forget things or, forget to turn in an assignment or things that, he never had to write anything down, right? He would just know. And now, as we got into, this was the end of sophomore year of high school, that it was a little bit off. And then in June, we went to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician is like, this really sounds, like, he had COVID. this sounds like long COVID. And then we were referred to the area long COVID pass clinic, which took till September to be seen, right? Mm-hmm. So, we knew in June, we didn't see somebody till September. We did get in to see a sleep specialist in August before we saw the long COVID clinic. But, as the summer progressed, the sleep issues were really a challenge. And it felt like we barely were making it through. He was a lifeguard. He teaches, in a boating program, and it just felt like every day, like he was exhausted by the time he got home, and it was a struggle to get him there. And but we did it, right? And I do think that being outside helped his circadian rhythms a little bit, because it all fell apart starting in September.
Robin, can we talk a little bit more about like school and accommodations? And so we have some cognitive executive functioning things that sounds like she had a 504 for, and some accommodations for that. Was she also having any kind of fatigue issues or any kind of post-exertion malaise kind of thing?
I don't think she was having any of that that malaise like after activity. Kind of what I was picking up on was just a little bit more tired than a typical kiddo after school. So after school, she's been doing this since she had it. She'll come home and crash a little bit on the couch and just zone out. Like I said, Mondays are easier after the weekend of like timeout or rest or whatever. But by Thursday evening, she's kind of a wreck. She's useless.
Do you think if she hadn't been hospitalized, they would have been able to detect something was different?
Oh, interesting.
Like if Katie hadn't been hospitalized, I'm just curious. And she said, I feel like I'm not keeping up. Do you think the response would have been different?
No, I don't. Partly because of conversations I've had with the teachers. I think they might have picked up on it, but it might have been a different maybe approach.
I was just curious. I think because a lot of our parents report difficulty connecting it to COVID.
Right. And we might have attributed it to ADHD, not picking up on the fact that she's actually just really tired and run down and having that brain fog.
Amy, tell us about what has it been like at school?
So we started school. He started in September with junior year, and he was in all honors classes and one AP class. So very similar to his sophomore distribution as far as levels. And I wanted to check, but our system's offline because they're loading the new schedule for the fall. But I seem to remember that in the first term, he had in the teens for absences. So it's a 4-term school year, so he had over 10 absences. He had no 401k, right? We didn't have anything set up. He had a great group of friends who I think were his buddies in terms of helping him to keep up and sending him notes. We did tell all of the teachers that he had long COVID proactively. I started out the school year because high school, there's not a whole lot of continuity, right? You don't have the same teachers or even the same pool, right? So they knew. He managed to sort of keep up and do, fairly well if you look at a distribution of grades, nowhere near what he was doing before COVID. But then, in early November, it just got much worse. And, that is sort of like the peak. It started to get worse with the peak of ragweed. So, which is another one of his allergies.
Oh, okay. So how many months was this after infection when you really started it?
So it was November.
So he was infected in the spring. It's
Yeah.
November when you started seeing the symptoms get worse.
Yeah.
And it
So
coincided with an allergy that he already had.
Yes. Yes. And then the week of Veterans Day, he stopped going to school and he never went back. So we then had to go through and figure out because the school system, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but the accommodations came in, like we had a 504 plan put into place. He was denied an IEP because even with all those absences, he was performing at a higher level than the norm, not at his level, right? But at a higher level than the norm. And the school was like, well, he needs to come back, and it was kind of being treated almost like school avoidance. And I'm like, this is a kid who wants to be in school, who misses his friends, misses the classes, and this is not school avoidance. So we got a medical excuse for term 2. We were told that even with the letters from Boston Children's and everything, that could only be one term of medically excused. And then in December, I was like, well, he can't come back. His sleep schedule right now is completely opposite of normal, right? He's going to bed when I'm waking up. And no matter what we do, we can't get him on track. Light box, everything, melatonin. We started trying medicines. So in the end, he went on what's called home hospital, which is a program, and it was asynchronous online learning. He had to restart all of his classes. And he had tutors, and it was an incredibly lonely time. And it probably wasn't the right thing, but it was the only path we could find to keep him from having to repeat junior year.
The difference between, there are usually 2 paths that are normally explored. Well, I guess let's talk about homebound for because in case people don't know. So there's a homebound usually option for parents, and that is typically designed for people with like acute illness, like they've been hospitalized after a car accident, or they're going through cancer treatment or something like that. That's really what that program's designed for. Based on what I know as a teacher, they're not really long-term programs. So when you say I could only get it for a semester, it's because that's the type of patient it's designed for. Then we have something like a 504 plan, which is basically accommodations for a disability. So that's the child's still in class, they still get the same instruction, but there's some accommodations, like you get to sit closer to the teacher, we'll cue you more, we'll remind you more, things like that. And then there is, as far as disability accommodations, there's also modifications. A modification is when you modify the curriculum. So you either modify what is being taught, how it's being taught, when it's being taught, that sort of thing. And in order to do that, you need what's called an IEP, or an individualized education plan. What I hear from a lot of parents is that there's different ways to qualify. A lot of long COVID kids have cognitive challenges, but when they go to request modification of curriculum or instruction, which would require an IEP, they're denied because they're not able to demonstrate the challenges they're having on the current assessment tools we have. And this is a consistent theme every time I talk to a parent of a long COVID kid who's a teenager specifically, is that they don't remember things in class. They don't remember to turn it in. They don't remember the instruction on a Tuesday, but maybe on a Friday they do remember it. And so what I think we're missing in all of this is the waxing and waning, which is the hallmark of a condition like long COVID. And so if you assess them on the day they're feeling really great, you're not going to catch it. If you assess them on a day they're not feeling great, then it doesn't align with what maybe the teacher sees in the classroom. So that like lack of alignment then gets to be problematic. Because I think one of the issues here is that we don't have assessment tools for conditions that are dynamic. And so what's happening is that our kids are getting pushed out of standard classrooms. It's so incredibly important to stay connected to schools because that's the community, that's everything for our kids. So the question was about teachers, because I think it's so interesting that it sounds like long COVID was really identified first by Katie going, something's wrong. And then by the teacher going, wait a minute, there is something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think, I don't know, I just want to highlight that for anyone listening, because as I was a reading specialist, so schools all the time, teachers all the time are the first ones to see the disability, especially when it's cognitive challenges. It's the schools all the time. And if the school doesn't know that that's actually long COVID,
right,
that's an impediment. So it's important for schools to understand that. You want to add to that?
Yeah. The teacher noticed right away that that Katie was taking a long time to respond and was needing extra prompting and to kind of keep her up to speed and keep her going. And she thought at first, like maybe she's shy or just getting used to the classroom, especially after having had COVID and being absent and that sort of thing. But after a few months, it was still happening. So, and so about that, like I said, like Katie mentioned it to me and I checked in with the teacher. The teacher said, yes, actually that is a thing. So I think even without the hospitalization, the teacher would have picked up on it because it is pretty significant. I just went camping with Katie and I'm like, still like waiting. And especially on day 3 of camping, there's no way she's going to be able to go get me a glass of water. So, it's pretty marked. And the teacher definitely was great about supporting Katie.
Amy, what do you think other parents need to know about long COVID? What would you say?
I think that it's every child is different, right? Like that, even if, like my son has it's all cognitive neurological, right? That he displays, but it is not necessarily what another child, right? He doesn't have the gastro issues, and he had lung functioning issues, but that has improved, right? And he doesn't have cardiac issues. He doesn't seem to have any sort of the post-exertional fatigue, right? That it's not a physical thing for him. It's all cognitive, but every child, I think can articulate. So parents should be listening to their children, right? When your child said something like, I'm not keeping up, right? Or I'm falling behind, or, those kinds of things, are important to listen to, and to seek help, right? I found tremendous help in the long COVID families, as well as, discovering that there was a whole community of parents who had children, in special ed, and they've been a wealth of resources in trying to navigate this, even though we don't quite fit in that bucket. But finding people who are going through things is really important, not to be alone.
What would you say, Robin, that you tell other parents about long COVID?
trust your gut and believe your child. And, you know, it might not be easy to kind of tease out or figure out what's happening, but believe your child is struggling and doing the best they can. I think it's really important to keep them engaged with other kids and school, regardless of what age they are. So that might look different but depending on, you know, the age and what long COVID looks like for them, but keeping them engaged somehow. And the family too might have different needs, and figuring out what works for you as best you can to keep them around other kids. And when seeking support with the school, to work with the school and just be in communication with the teachers. Amy mentioned that too, like letting the teachers know what your kiddo needs, and letting them know what's going on, and kind of building that support by building relationship with the school. And then when you do need to move forward with something more formal, letting the teacher know, and then sending an email to the teacher mentioning what it is you need, or why, you know. The school might have to decide what that looks like for them at the school, but this is what my kiddo's experiencing and why, you know, and then sending that email to your teacher and somebody in administration, whether that's like special ed or whoever, you know, is going to be on your team, and getting them involved from the get-go. I know I outlined, you know, the challenges Katie was having and kind of the questions I had. She eventually was assessed, and so for an IEP, and so I detailed, you know, what areas she seemed to be struggling in, so that they could look at that and kind of figure it out.
Amy, if you could actually be able to change one thing that would make it easier for long COVID kids in schools, what do you think you would say?
I, you know, have been thinking a lot about, you know, with preparing for this panel to, you know, how my child got COVID. And, you know, I think that we really need to take a look at ventilation and all of that. And it's not just for children with long COVID, like there's all sorts of other like respiratory diseases. And I think that, you know, that has not been on anybody's radar. So I don't know if that would have stopped the infection, but, you know, I posted something recently, and a parent came back with, well, I have long COVID too. And if your, you know, son ever needs to talk to somebody, I'm here, right? But she's like, I'm so glad that my child didn't get long COVID. And it was me, right? And so it's like, you know, if we can spare somebody from going through this, then we should be doing that. We should be looking at how to mitigate and keep children safe.
Well, looking at the numbers and knowing long COVID families and kids, and the things that we're learning in that group, assume that a lot of kids actually do have long COVID. Because, I mean, if you look at it, probably most of the kids have had COVID at some point, and there's a pretty high percentage. I mean, even 20% is a ton of kids.
I can share the current numbers are the CDC estimates more than 90% of children have had COVID at least once. Meta-analysis shows that 25% of kids develop long COVID upon infection. Some of those children, and that's defined as symptomatic at week 4 post-infection. So some of those children do heal within week 5 to week 12. If they hit week 12, it's less likely that the symptoms go away. But those that do heal in that window often go on to develop it if they get further reinfections. We know that when the Omicron wave hit, 16% of those children who were reinfected did go on to develop long COVID. So if you put all those numbers together, that suggests millions and millions of kids.
Wow. Yeah. So I think schools need to approach it as if a ton of our students have long COVID, and to think about what that might look like, and think about how to accommodate the physical needs, whether that's resting or, thinking about post-exertional malaise and those sorts of things too, and allowing kids to pace and communicate that with their providers and teachers and PE teachers and whoever, but also that brain fog. And if you identify somebody who might have long COVID, really early intervention and supporting a kiddo, my daughter's learning to read. That's really essential to the rest of her education. So jumping in there and really helping those students learn those foundational skills, and then keeping them engaged, like Amy's son, figuring out, being creative and figuring out ways to keep him plugged in and somehow.
I also, from the brain fog perspective, I think that like working with a cognitive SLP has not made the brain fog go away, but has certainly, like, he has a weekly meeting during the school year with a cognitive SLP, and that is helping him to create ways of managing the brain fog.
Can you explain what an SLP is?
So the SLP stands for speech and language pathologist. And so Boston Children's said that we should be looking for somebody who had expertise in helping children after concussions. So that's the path that we went down to find our provider, was that she was somebody who had worked in our community with children who had had concussions. And a lot of those protocols help him manage the pacing, the cognitive, when he gets fatigued, especially with math, and, doing frequent breaks. He uses it's called the Pomodoro method. And his computer has a Chrome extension, so it will stop him after 25 minutes and make him take a 5-minute break. But he's really internalized it at this point, but it helps him to manage the brain fog.
All right. Thank you very much for being here and for sharing your stories.